Hi, I'm Max. I'm a software engineer and game developer, and this is what I've been working on for the past few weeks. The concept is that it's a roguelike that stays entirely on one screen, and the level continually drops in new tiles during gameplay. So far I've just been calling it Falling World, but I don't really like that name and want to change it. In the gameplay you can see groups of tiles that I call chunks, falling down and replacing existing tiles and creating new walls and enemies. I came up with this concept from a combination of my last two game projects that I stopped working on. One was a simulation game that stayed in a small grid like this, and the other game was inspired by Kirby's Dream Course, where hitting enemies with higher speeds does more damage to them. This is kind of a combination of the two. It stays in one screen, and your movement is what deals damage to enemies, though there's no difference how fast you're moving. Most of the features are already in, things like movement, some enemies, some tiles, some presets and all that, but this is really just the beginning. I don't want this project to go on for too long though. Ideally I'd like to finish in a couple weeks, but it's more likely a couple months because I can only work on this in my free time after work. In this project, making things very telegraphed and obvious was an important design decision that I made early on. And I think that a lot of these things show off in both the gameplay and art. The tiles flash a warning before they're replaced so that enemies can get out of the way or else they'll be damaged by falling tiles, and the same with enemy attacks. They do a very clear warning of exactly where they're going to attack. These warnings are to avoid the attacks feeling unfair, because if you're given a warning and enough time and you still take damage, you only have yourself to blame. Right now it's possible to get stuck from the walls coming down around you, but I plan to add a feature that lets the player break through the walls by hitting them a few times so that they are never stuck with nothing to do. So far I've added 4 enemy types and have a few more planned for this first area. First there's a gnome, and I have to say this is just my favorite design. I love it, it's just so simple and cute, and it reminds me of those kids that put those really thick snow outfits on. The gnome dashes around in random directions and moves several spaces at a time, but if it's near the player it will run up and try to attack. These guys are pretty much just the grunts of the game with no real special mechanic to them. The next enemy I added was the worm, which I also think is really cute, but what makes it my favorite is the gameplay mechanic. The worm moves slowly and never actually attacks, but then when the player damages one of its halves, I just love this so much. It's my favorite thing in the game right now. The second phase is technically a new type of enemy. I call it a woe, but it just freaks out and attacks sometimes. The idea with the worm is to show players that just dashing through the enemies isn't always the best way to go, and sometimes enemies need more thought into how you attack them. Because if you attack from the sides and go through both halves, the worm is no danger, but if you hit only one half, then it becomes much more difficult to deal with and actually attacks now, and that's a threat that could have been completely avoided. The next enemy is the queen bee, and this enemy actually has a unique ability of, instead of attacking, she spawns a bee. These bees wander around and attack randomly, and they actually use my default enemy behavior, so they're pretty dumb. I may make them smarter in the future, but for now this is fine. The intended effect of the queen bee is to have a more important enemy for the player to focus on, and for them to go after as soon as they can before she has a chance to spawn more bees, and just by leaving the game a bit, the level gets filled with bees pretty quickly. You may have noticed that only one of these enemies actually targets and moves after the player. Most of them actually just move randomly, and there is a few reasons for that. First, I wanted to avoid the zombie effect where enemies just move toward the player. It may create some agency, but really it's not that interesting and kind of looks just lazy. It's also kind of hard to explain. Why are these enemies just pursuing the player with the only goal being to kill them and not caring about their own life? I wanted to feel like this world was just kind of vibing and the enemies are defending themselves rather than hunting you. Even if world building isn't a focus of the game, just having enemies with zombie AI can create a disconnect that makes the game feel a lot more bland, and suddenly the answer to, oh there's an enemy, what should I do, is always, well I have to kill it before it gets to me, which isn't very interesting unless it's expanded upon in some notable way. Right now with the state of the game, it may seem like it has a similar problem because the answer to, oh there are some enemies, is just to wait for them to line up and then ram through all of them. However, this is an answer to the problems for now. I'm totally cool with that being the case for this very first level, because that won't be the case in future levels, where I plan to have enemies that you need to attack from certain sides, or just trying to ram through any enemies may be what gets you killed. I think that understanding how players solve problems and then taking away that answer is a great way to create a compelling learning curve. It lets players feel smart before realizing that they have to approach the problem from a new angle when another factor comes into play. And having more subtle ways of optimizing how you play, like the plan of attacking worms from the side, is a cool way for players to gain mastery. I really like how this tile replacement thing is working out right now. I just have a small list of pre-made chunks and they fall down randomly on the grid, but even though it's entirely random, sometimes it creates this emergent level design that makes it look like it's intentionally putting together a cohesive level that is segmented and has rooms, but it's actually just pure randomness. I think this concept also has a lot of interesting potential in how it transitions from one level to another. I think it'd be really interesting to slowly introduce more of the next area's tiles, and suddenly you're not just standing in grassy plains from the first level, but actually it's looking more and more like a swamp, giving the illusion that you're almost traveling to this new area without ever leaving the small confined grid. For the chunks, I made it as easy as possible for me to make new presets. I just make a prefab, give it some tiles and enemies, and then give it to my level generation, which takes care of picking the chunks, making sure they fit, and spawning all the tiles and the enemies in the prefab. I really like where the art style is going in this. I talked earlier about wanting to make the more important things more obvious to the player, and so I focused on designing the characters with a lot of contrast. I gave all the enemies a big outline, making them super visible even during chaotic gameplay and on a small screen. And I kept the background as a mid-value color so that both the black highlights on the enemies and the white highlights on the player would be very obvious. So that pretty much wraps up what I have so far. Next I want to work on showing a lot more feedback and juice, or game feel if you want to call it that. Then I want to work on the first boss of the game, which I think is the next step towards a fully playable game loop. I also want to make a video maybe on how I go through the process of adding a new enemy, because I think that pipeline is actually pretty cool. Any comments on what you want to see more in these devlogs or in the game would be super appreciated. If you want to keep up with this project, the best way is just to subscribe and turn on notifications, or to follow me on Twitter. Thanks everyone, see you next time.